Has anyone ever told you that women have superpowers? Actually, scrap that. Has anyone ever told you that women are powerful? Or do you live in this sort of thought process that we're irrational, illogical, unpredictable, emotional, we have mood swings, we're not as productive? If you live in this thought process, I am here to debunk that, and I am here to show you that we as women have superpowers that are hidden within our menstrual cycle, and that if we were just able to understand our menstrual cycle, understand our normal, natural, and just so beautiful biology, we could unleash, unravel, and discover our superpowers, use them to our advantage, and live a life that is more beautiful, more effortless, more productive, more radiant, right? We as women have superpowers, we just don't know about them. And I'm here to share with you guys. And honestly, I am so freaking excited to share this with you. So freaking blessed that you guys decided to join on this journey. And let's go. It's going to be a long video, but it's going to be filled with so much goodness, so much information that genuinely everyone should listen to, men and women alike, because you will get so much out of it. You will be able to finally understand your biologies, ladies. Like, finally understand how we work. And it's the most beautiful gift that I think that I can give you, is understanding how we work as women so that you can use that to your advantage and understand finally what this sort of like buzzword cycle syncing means. Today I'm not going to be doing the whole, you should follow me there, do this, do that, because this video is already super, super long. All of the links are below. My other channel, my Instagram, my YouTube, todo es en la descripción, ¿vale? Just go there if you want to find anything. It's going to be in there. Before we start, the other thing that I want to talk to you guys about is for people that are listening to this on a podcast, on audio format, I would really, really urge you for this time to actually switch to YouTube, because I have a whole presentation to share with you guys. This is a complex thing that I'm going to be sharing with you. There's a lot of diagrams. I want to make it as educational as possible, but it's a very, very complex cycle, a very, very complex thing to understand. That's why a lot of us don't know about it. So I'm trying to debunk it, make it as accessible as possible to you. But for that to happen, I need visuals. So I don't know how much you're going to get out of just listening to it on audio. You can re-listen to it later on with the audio. But I would say if the first time, please just switch to YouTube, watch the visuals. This is the best way that you can really unlock all your beautiful superpowers. So, entonces, I'm going to just put the presentation up, do this whole thing, and I'll be with you in a second. Okay, so we're into the presentation, finally. We're going to be talking today about the menstrual cycle, as I said, uncovering women's hidden superpowers. But let's get into it. Who is this for? I think I've alluded to it slightly, but I think a lot of you guys are going to think that this is for women, individuals with ovaries, premenopausal women, girls, just basically women that are in their fertile stage of life, so between about 13 to 55. But actually, I'm here to tell you that this is for everyone. This is not just for women, because everyone, even if you're a male, even if you don't have ovaries and you don't menstruate, you have a sister, you have a mother, you have a partner. And it's really, really important for all of us to understand how the menstrual cycle works, understand what we as women are blessed with. And it is important for men, for people that don't menstruate, to also understand how we work. And so because the more we can understand how each one of us works and appreciate how different we are, the better we can live in harmony. If we expect the other person, the opposite sex, to operate exactly the same way as us, when we're not meant to, we're not made to, we actually are doing everybody a disservice. But if we understand how the opposite sex works as well, then we can more beautifully coexist in harmony, have better balance, have better relationships. So I really, really do believe that this is a super, super important thing for all of us, not just for women, not just for people that menstruate, everyone. But a disclaimer before we start. This is really, really important, so please listen. This is for educational purposes only. Vale? I know that I'm a medical student. I will become a doctor one day, but one, I am not a doctor, and two, this is not medical advice. But if there's anything that you realize, I have an issue with this, I feel like I need to seek advice, please go do seek that advice, but seek professional medical advice if you need that. Also, for your information, all of the scientific papers that I've talked about, used, or anything like that in this video or in this podcast will be linked at the end of the presentation, but also in the description below. So if you do want to dive deeper, if you want to understand more of anything that I've said, please go dive into a bit more, understand it a bit more, dive into the science of it. I will leave all of the links down below. And if you have any questions, anything that you think that I could help you with understanding this a bit better, please leave a comment. go into my DMs. We can have conversations there. So what are we going to talk about? We're first going to talk about the main players, as in like the main characters involved in this our menstrual cycle, so we get an understanding. We're then going to have an overview of how the menstrual cycle works, phases, the different phases of our cycle, and we're going to dive deep into them so we can understand them a lot deeper. Then we're going to move into hormones. And then once we understand this, that's only when we can actually dive into cycle syncing. Okay, moving on to the first part, which is the main players. So the way I'm going to look at this is that I don't want to overwhelm you too much with all the information. As I said, this is a very, very complex cycle. There's a lot of things happening at the same time, and I want to give you guys information about it in a layered approach, one after the other, so that we can build our knowledge over the time that we have together. So we're going to start off with just talking about the players involved. So what are the kind of organs, the kind of hormones that are involved in this sort of beautifully orchestrated situation? So we have as organs, we have the brain that's involved. So this is actually, if you take this brain here, like that's a brain, if you cut it in half here, exactly there, and then you separate it, this is what you would see on the inside. So this is what that is. And then I gave you kind of like a zoomed in version of what part of the brain, because the brain is very, very complex. So what part of the brain is actually involved in this? So we have actually this part here, which is this part there, and then this part here, which is the pituitary gland, which is here. So what is actually involved is the hypothalamus, which is this section here, and then the anterior pituitary, which is another part of the brain. And then we have the female reproductive system, which is involved. So the female reproductive system, we have the ovaries that are important, and then we have the uterus lining mainly, and then the cervix. But if we do a quick recap of like what this actually is, this is the female reproductive organs. We have the vagina here, cervix, uterus, fallopian tubes, and then the ovaries here. Vale? And then we have hormones that are also really important players of this whole beautifully orchestrated event and cycle. So we have progesterone that I'm sure you've heard about, estrogen that I'm sure you've heard about. We have GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone. We'll talk about her in a second. Luteinizing hormone, and FSH, which is follicular stimulating hormone. We'll talk about all of them in a second. So now we have a good overview of who is involved in this. But as you can see here, I've put a little diagram of a football player. And I'm going to use a football analogy for this. For a team to work efficiently in football, it's not good enough to know who's on the team. It's not good enough to know that there's Giroud, Mbappé, and Varane, let's say, in my team, right? As if you don't know, I'm French, so the only players that I know are French football players, but it's a different story for another day. So it's not good enough to just know the players that you have within your team. Those players have to be organized and each know their position within the team so that the team can work in a beautiful way to get the result that they want to. So then you know that Mbappé is an attacking person, that there's somebody on the defense, and that Lloris, so like it's a new guy now, but like somebody is on the goalie, right? People need to know their place. They need to know, am I center, am I attacking, am I defending, am I the goalie? Because I need to know my place so that then together we can work as a team and get a beautiful result. It's the same thing with the menstrual cycle. It's not good enough to just know who's involved. It's important and actually crucial to understand who lies where. So this is what we're doing here. Who lies where? So we have the brain that lies at the top. So we have, as I said, the hypothalamus at the top, as well as the anterior pituitary. So they're connected. And then we have underneath, this is an ovary cut in half. Don't worry about this. This is just the ovary for now. Have the ovary underneath, that is in the middle, and then we have here the uterus as well as the cervix, right? So this is really, really important. So we have now the positioning. But if we think about our football team, it's not good enough to have players and know where they are in the team, know where they lie on the football court. They need to all speak the same language. They need to all be able to understand each other, right? And communicate appropriately. And so it's the same thing with our cycle. How do these different organs communicate with each other? They communicate with each other through hormones. Okay, this is the language that they speak, hormone language. And so what happens is that the hypothalamus at the top here secretes GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone. Let's just debunk this word for a hot sec, just so that we understand what's happening here. Testes, so that's like balls, basically, for people that don't know. Testes and ovaries are the organs within the human body that have the eggs within them. And then when these two types of eggs, so the sperm cells and the ovum, so the egg from the ovaries come together, the sperm fertilizes the egg, and then they make a new baby, right? And so testes and ovaries are actually called gonads. So the organs that hold the egg, that then comes together, that holds these cells that then come together to make a new human being, are called gonads. And so this hormone here is called gonadotropin releasing hormone. So it's the hormone that is released to help gonads release their cells out of the organ so that the two cells can meet together and make a baby, essentially. Kind of like in broad, very undetailed terms. But this can probably help you as to remember why it's called gonadotropin releasing hormone, because it has to do with the gonads. Releasing these hormones will help the gonads release their cell so that the two cells can come together and make a baby. So at the top here, we have the hypothalamus releasing gonads, gonadotropin releasing hormone, not gonads. And then we have the anterior pituitary that how do they communicate? We have LH, so luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicular stimulating hormone. This is what they secrete. The ovaries, then they will secrete estrogen and progesterone, so E and P. The uterus lining and the cervix don't really release anything. But again, going back to our football analogy, it's not good enough for our players to be able to talk a language and communicate that way. Our players need to be able to understand and communicate effectively, right? Players need to be able to receive information from another player, but also communicate an information back to the player, right? It needs to be a two-way street. It's the same thing for our cycle. It's not good enough that our hypothalamus can just release this hormone and that our anterior pituitary can just release these hormones. They need to be able to communicate with each other and understand what's happening between each other. That's exactly what's happening here. So now I've added arrows. So the hypothalamus will secrete the gonadotropin releasing hormone into the bloodstream. This is where hormones are. They are secreted in the blood, and then that's where the rest of the organs can pick them up and understand the signal that's coming. So gonadotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus. Vale? And then the anterior pituitary at some point is like, ooh, I'm understanding a communication. I'm receiving the message of the gonadotropin releasing hormone. I'm understanding what's happening here. Okay, now that I have this message and I've received this sort of letter, this communication, I'm now going to respond to that by secreting my own hormones, which are LH and FSH. So then they secrete these hormones, and then these hormones go into the bloodstream. And then the ovaries at some point is like, ooh, wait, hang on a minute. I'm recognizing this signal. I'm recognizing this communication. I understand this language. Okay, thank you, FSH. Thank you, LH. I got your message. I got your letter. I'm now going to respond to this by myself secreting something and sending a message and sending a signal back. So I'm going to secrete estrogen. I'm going to secrete progesterone. Then, same thing. Our uterus and our cervix will respond and receive these messages. They don't secrete really anything, but they receive these messages and they respond accordingly. They change their behavior. They receive those messages like, okay, I'm going to change my uterus lining. Okay, I'm going to change my cervical mucus plug situation. We're going to talk about this later. Don't get bogged down by this. It's not important right now. Okay, so you can see that they communicate from a top-down approach. Brain, so hypothalamus, anterior pituitary to the ovaries, and the ovaries to the uterus and the cervix, right? But it's actually not that simple. It's not good enough to just be able to communicate in one direction. As I said, communication is back and forth. If only Mbappe was able to only talk to his teammate, it would never be efficient. You need the teammate that's able to respond back, and they both understand what's happening. We could have a good communication, a good conversation, vale? And it's the same thing here. The ovaries actually secrete, as I said, the estrogen, the progesterone, and that message goes into the blood, and the brain can actually understand that message back. So the brain can be like, okay, I'm receiving these hormones, I'm receiving this signal, I'm receiving this message, and so now I can respond to it accordingly. Cool? So it's a two-way street. It goes from the top down, but also the ovaries can go back to the top. The ovaries can communicate back with the hypothalamus, can communicate back with the anterior pituitary, and then it's kind of like a cycle. It's a communication. It's appropriate communication. So this is kind of like how an overview of how everybody works in the team, how it's beautifully orchestrated. But it's a lot more complex than that, and this is what we're going to be talking about now. So, you know how we call this the menstrual cycle, right? This is this kind of the term that we hear about all the time. But actually, the menstrual cycle is a superposition of multiple different cycles that are happening at the same time and beautifully orchestrated. So we have the ovarian cycle, what's happening within the ovaries, that's just what it means. Then we also have the uterine cycle, what is happening within the uterus. And what's happening within the uterus, plus what's happening within the ovaries, plus what's happening within the brain. So what's happening at all those levels together makes up the menstrual cycle. But for us to understand it, we need to be able to understand that there's different cycles working together beautifully that overlap to make this beautiful menstrual cycle that we as women experience. Cool. So going back to this image here, we're going to please don't worry about any of this right now. We are going to be detailing all of this. This will make sense to you in a bit. But don't get too scared. It's actually not that scary. We're going to work through it together. Let's just go first on the ovarian cycle at the top. Before I go on to this, I just want to show you actually what this is. This here is actually exactly the same thing that's happening in this ovary here. So you have these circles, and then at some point there's a little thing that comes out of the ovary, and then it becomes yellow and shrivels up and dies. And actually what's happening here is the ovarian cycle. So what happens in the ovary is that they receive, GnRH is secreted, released, put out into the blood, goes into the anterior pituitary, receives the message and is like, okay, cool, thank you, GnRH, I got the signal. Now it's my turn to respond to this, and I'm going to secrete FSH, which is follicular stimulating hormone. So why is FSH called follicular stimulating hormone? It's actually really, really simple. Follicular stimulating hormone, there's the word follicle in it, right? Follicles are actually these little circles that you can see here within the ovary. And the follicle is actually just a circle that has a little cell in it, and the cell is the ovum, it's the egg, that is then ejected. And so follicular stimulating hormone is secreted after you receive the message from the hypothalamus, from gonadotropin releasing hormone. It's secreted, and then the ovaries is like, ooh, I'm receiving the message of follicular stimulating hormone. What am I now going to do? I'm going to stimulate the growth of my follicles. So this hormone here is allowing the follicles within the ovaries to start growing in size. So I'm growing. The more I grow, follicles, what do follicles do? Follicles grow, they have the egg in it, and then the egg is expulsed. But also when follicles grow, they secrete estrogen. Estrogen is secreted by the ovaries, as I mentioned earlier, but we're adding a layer of complexity. Estrogen is secreted by follicles, the follicles within the ovary. So yes, it's the ovary, but it's actually more specifically the follicles within the ovary that secrete estrogen. And even more specific than that, it's the growing follicles under the influence of follicular stimulating hormone that actually secrete estrogen. So estrogen is secreted by the follicles that are growing. At some point, the follicle gets so big, it's like, okay, it's time to kind of erupt, get the egg out of the ovary. If you kind of take this ovary, put it where it lies within the reproductive system of a woman, the ovary would get out into the fallopian tube and kind of wait around here, waiting to see if there's a sperm cell that will come and fertilize it. And then once the egg is out, the follicle that stays there actually becomes yellow. Corpus luteum. Luteum is like the root of the word luteum is, I think, is luti something. I don't really know what it is, but it basically means yellow. So corpus luteum means yellow body. And then the yellow body is there and it starts to shrivel up, and then it dies. And the reason why the P is here for progesterone is because it's the yellow body, the corpus luteum, that secretes progesterone. So now again, we're adding another layer of complexity. It's not the ovary that is secreting progesterone. It's actually more specifically the yellow body, the corpus luteum within the ovary that secretes progesterone. Okay? And then these have an effect on the brain, first of all, but also on the reproductive system downstream, on the uterus lining and on the cervix. So now that we've explained this, you can see what this actually is. This is the phase of the growing follicle. Then the follicle is so big, it erupts, has the egg that comes out. This is ovulation. And then the follicle that has erupted becomes the corpus luteum, the yellow body, and then it shrivels up, it starts to die, it stops being yellow, and then it's the corpus albicans, which is just like the dead follicle, right? So this is the ovarian cycle. And as I mentioned earlier, right, the follicle starts to grow under the influence of FSH, follicular stimulating hormone. And so if you start to kind of put a few things together that I've mentioned, and we start looking at those graphs, which are basically just graphs of how the hormone levels are going, if they're going up or down within the cycle, you can see that the growing follicle, so the follicle under the influence of the follicular stimulating hormone that is allowing the follicle to grow, right, from the anterior pituitary here, you can see that the follicular stimulating hormone is actually increasing, steadily increasing as the follicle is growing. I also told you that the follicles that are growing are the ones that are secreting estrogens, right? Estradiol is basically estrogen. And you can see it works perfectly. As the follicle is growing, estrogen is rising. It's on the rise. I also told you that the corpus luteum is what secretes progesterone. Cool. Corpus luteum is here, and you can see that its progesterone is increasing. So this graph is already starting to make sense, right? But before we make it make a bit more sense, we're going to dive anyways into all of these things very, very deeply, so don't worry. As I said, I'm just trying my best to make it as logical as possible so that people don't get too lost. But now, as I told you, we call this the menstrual cycle. Why is it a cycle? It's because it's something that repeats itself over and over and over and over again until menopause, right? And within the menstrual cycle, you have different phases. A lot of the times, I think a lot of us believe and think that we have periods because we can see the period, right? You can see the blood on the tampon, you can see the blood on the pad, you can see that you're having your period, but we often think about it as like period, no period. If I'm not having my period, I'm in a state of like, I'm not having my period, and then I have my period. But actually, the menstrual cycle has different phases. It's not because you're not in your period moment, so menses, menstruation, that's like the period, that you're just in no phase at all. It's actually not true. We're always in the phase of our cycle, and it's not just period, no period. And that's what we're actually going to dive into right now, is the different phases and diving deeper into what's happening into every single phase of our menstrual cycle. So as you can see here, menstrual cycle is about 28 days. That's kind of the textbook perfect length cycle. But again, it's oftentimes between 28 days and 35, una cosa así. So 0 to 28 days. And actually when you see here is that we have a follicular phase, 0 to 14. Then we have ovulation, and then we have luteal phase. So it's not period, no period. It's actually period within the follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase, period within the follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase. It's not period, no period. As I told you, this is a beautiful team that is working together, orchestrating, communicating with each other in a beautiful, beautiful way to allow you to even have your period. Having your period is the result of so many things that have worked together multiple days to allow this period to happen. A period does not just happen out of the blue. It's a beautiful communication of things that we're going to talk about and that we've already started to talk about. So now that I've introduced this, let's dive into each phase more specifically. So, as I told you, follicular is the first phase of our cycle. The menses, period, menstruation, the moment of your cycle where you're bleeding, is actually within the follicular phase. The follicular phase is called follicular phase because it's the phase where the follicle is growing. Everything is starting to make sense, isn't it? And before we dive into this a bit more deeply, I think a good way to look at the menstrual cycle is actually understanding that you can kind of think about the different phases of your menstrual cycle as seasons. So your menstruation, your period, your menses, the month where you're bleeding, is actually your inner winter. Things have slowed down. It's really slow. It's a bit darker. It's gloomy. It's slower. You're by the fire pit. You want to just cozy up. That's menstruation. So what is actually happening during menstruation? So it's this phase of the graph here. So the follicles are slowly starting to grow a little bit. But as a general statement, all hormones are actually quite low. So if you look at here, yes, estrogen is slightly increasing because the follicles are starting to grow, right? That's what's happening in the follicular stage, but it's still quite low. Progesterone, which is the other blue line here, is just really, really low. FSH is slightly increasing. That's the light blue line here, slightly, but again, it's quite low, especially at the beginning phases of the period. And then the LH, luteinizing hormone, is also really low. We're not going to look at body temperature for now. We don't have enough knowledge to understand what body temperature means for now. So we're just staying in these two areas. The top, these two graphs, and then the bottom here, the uterine cycle. And as we all know, the period is the time of the month where we're bleeding. And why are we bleeding? It's because our uterus lining, the lining within our uterus that has grown during the cycle, the previous cycle, and we'll talk about why it grows later, is actually shedding. The reason why we have a uterus lining that grows during our cycle is actually because our body is a beautiful, beautiful thing. It wants us to make babies, first of all, but also it wants our babies to have a comfortable house. It wants the embryo, which is the beginning stages of making a baby, when the sperm cell and the egg cell have come together, fertilized. It starts to make an embryo, and then it's the embryo that starts growing, goes into a fetus, and then makes a whole grown baby. Our bodies are the embryo to be in a comfortable house. It doesn't want it to be hard and cold and gloomy. It wants it to be in a nice little house. And so the reason for this house to be nice, it has to be in the uterus lining. That's what's happening. In the uterus lining, which is like comfortable, it's kind of squishy, there's a lot of blood in there. It's a great time for the embryo. But the problem is that if there's no baby that's made that cycle, the body's like, this house is not great anymore. Like, it's starting to be not optimal quality. So let's just shed it. Let's just decrease it, like get it out of our bodies, and we'll create a new house. We want our baby to have the best house possible. So we don't want to give them subpar, low effort house. So we're just going to deconstruct this house and we'll recreate a new house next time around because we want our baby to have the best house out there, kind of thing. This is what happens during our period. Our uterus lining is shedding. It's like, oh, this is not a good house anymore. We'll recreate one next month. So this is what's happening during menstruation. All our hormones are low. FSH is starting to increase slightly, and the uterus lining is shedding. And then you have proliferative phase. Proliferative is just meaning kind of increasing, growing phase of the follicular phase. So this is happening oftentimes between 7 to 14 days. All of the numbers that I put here are honestly just for first of all, it takes into account that the cycle will be 28 days. Not all of us, as I said, have a 28-day cycle. And also, like, menstruation and periods last different amounts of times for different people. I'm not a 7-day girly. I bleed for 3 days and that's it. So again, we're all very different. Okay, so it's important to have these for information, but again, it's not the be all and end all. We're all very different. But going back to proliferative. Proliferative is when things are growing, right? We said that follicles are growing. FSH will be increasing. As you can see here, it's making the follicle grow and grow and grow. Everything is blooming. Everything's on the rise. It's spring. It's our inner spring. So as I said, follicles are increasing in size, and the follicles are secreting, as I said, estrogen. And the more the follicle is growing, the more estrogen is secreted. And so you can see here that estradiol, or estrogen, is on the rise. So all of this is making sense. Quick little interruption, guys, just because I've noticed that I haven't emphasized the role of estrogen enough within the uterine cycle. I said that it was progesterone that was increasing the size of the uterus lining, which is true to some degree, but I wanted to give you guys the depth that you guys deserve. So in the proliferative phase, everything is growing. The follicles are growing, as I've mentioned, but the uterus lining is also growing under the influence of estrogen. So estrogen does have a role in increasing the size of the uterus lining. And then in luteal phase, I appreciate that we haven't talked about that yet, but progesterone is quite high and estrogen is also relatively high. Progesterone and estrogen will continue thickening up the uterus lining and making it even bigger, but progesterone has an added role of changing the texture of the uterus lining to make it cozier, to make it a little bit nicer for the embryo to want to implant there. So if you kind of think about it in an analogy, estrogen has a role in kind of creating the house, creating the foundations, increasing the uterus lining, but progesterone has a role of renovation. Yes, it's still building the house a little bit, but it has a big role in renovating and making this house a home. So the estrogen is building the house up from the ground up, and progesterone is actually taking this house, building it a little bit, and changing a few things, but mostly renovating it and changing this house into a home, if that makes sense. So that's what I wanted to tell you guys. Just wanted to add this level of depth, and then you can continue watching the video. Cool. I don't know if you've noticed when I was talking, sometimes I said follicle, singular, sometimes I said follicles, plural, but the way I kind of described the ovarian cycle, and even the way it's shown here, is that there's one follicle that's growing, it gets really big, ovulation happens, the egg comes out, corpus luteum, corpus albicans. Actually, it's follicles, plural, that grow every single cycle. Why? Women, people that have ovaries, we are born with all of our eggs. The moment you're born, you have all of your eggs within you. You can't create them. They don't multiply anymore. It's not like men. Men create their sperm on I don't remember how many day cycle, but they create their sperm. They're not born with it. They start creating sperm at puberty. Us women, we are born with all of our eggs. As you can see here on this graph, at birth, we have about 1 million eggs within our ovaries. At puberty, this has already shot down to 300,000 to 500,000 because some of the follicles, have died off, right? And then at age 32, we go from, let's say, 300,000 to 120,000. Okay, so basically, if we follow what I was saying, that only one follicle grows, it doesn't make sense. Because if you take menopause at 52 years old and you say that you had your first period, your first ovulation at 12, that's 40 years. And if you say that you have your period every single month for 12 months, every single year for 40 years, that's 12 times 40, that's I think 480 when I did the math earlier. That would mean that you would have 480 follicles that would grow, get an egg out, and then kind of die off corpus luteum, corpus albicans kind of thing. But it doesn't work because between puberty and age 32, when you're still at 32, you're still very much fertile and you can still have babies for a lot of years still, you lose over 200,000 eggs. So that means that every single cycle is not just one follicle that's growing. FSH, the follicular stimulating hormone, stimulates multiple follicles at the same time. And that's why estrogen is on the rise. That's why estrogen increases so much. It's not just one follicle that grows. It's multiple of them, a lot of them at the same time that are growing. And at some point, one of them will kind of be the chosen one, will be the biggest one, the one that has the best egg, the one it's just grown the most. It's just been like, I just kind of took all of the food for me kind of thing, like, responded to the follicular stimulating hormone the best. That's the one that will then go through ovulation just after. Okay, so again, it's important to note that it's not just one follicle that's growing within the ovarian cycle, within the ovary. It's actually multiple follicles that are growing at the same time, and that's why the estrogen is increasing so much. Cool. Moving on to ovulation. Ovulation is our superpower as women. Genuinely, ovulation is in my opinion, first of all, I'm a summer girly and ovulation is the summer or inner summer, but ovulation is like peak of everything. Like peak beauty, peak confidence, peak communication style, peak like just feeling just so good within yourself. You're like, wow, I can take on the world and nobody can stop me. This is how ovulation feels. If you have a normal quote unquote cycle and you understand how your cycle works and everything, ovulation is your superpower. And we'll talk about that when we're talking about cycle syncing, but ovulation is your superpower. It's honestly chef's kiss. I love it. It's great. But what's actually happening in ovulation? What happens? Actually, what's happening, remember when I said that our team players, right? The ovaries can communicate back to the hypothalamus. Remember when I was talking about that, and back to the brain and the anterior pituitary? This is actually what's happening in ovulation. The estrogen that's been increasing and increasing sharply because there's so many follicles growing at the same time, at some point it peaks. At some point it gets to a certain level that the brain is like, okay, I got the signal. Y'all, there's so much estrogen, and the estrogen goes above a certain threshold that the brain is like, right, it's now, the level of estrogen is now above the threshold, above my threshold that I allow for estrogen to be at. And so now, because I have that, I'm now going to respond by giving a surge, a quick, rapid peak increase of the anterior pituitary hormones releasing. So you're going to have, and mostly LH, so you're going to have a big peak of LH. So this is this line here, luteinizing hormone, and then also a peak of FSH, so follicular stimulating hormone. Let me repeat that. You have the ovarian hormone, which is the estrogen, that has increased so much, and it gets to a point where the brain is like, okay, now it's above my threshold. And now that it's above my threshold, I'm going to respond by giving a surge of LH from the anterior pituitary and FSH, but mostly LH. LH is the luteinizing hormone. Did I remember what I told you earlier? Corpus luteum, yellow, luteinizing hormone, yellowing hormone. Isn't that just beautiful? Anyways, maybe I'm just a nerd, but this is beautiful to me. Luteinizing hormone is the yellowing hormone. So it allows the follicle to rupture and allow the egg, so the ovum within the follicle, to get expulsed out of the ovary within the fallopian tube. And then the egg is going to just wait around and be like, I'm going to stay alive for maybe 24 hours, and I'm going to wait if there's like a little sperm cell that's going to want to fertilize me so we can make a baby together. That's kind of what's happening for the ovum. But if we forget about the ovum and we forget about the egg, because right now we're not making a baby, now the follicle has no ovum in it, and now it's yellowing. So now it becomes the corpus luteum. Hence why the luteinizing hormone is the yellowing hormone, the hormone that allows the follicle to become the corpus luteum, because it's allowed the follicle to rupture, get the ovum out, and now that the ovum is out, it's like, okay, I can be the corpus luteum now. That makes sense? It's so beautiful. This is what happens in ovulation. So what actually, if you do a little bit of a summary, estrogen peaks, triggers the LH secretion, LH surge, as well as FSH surge, and then the LH causes the follicle to rupture, ovum is secreted out. Beautiful. If you look as well as like the sex hormones are estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. Women are ruled by progesterone and estrogen, men are ruled by testosterone. But it doesn't mean that women don't have testosterone, it doesn't mean that men don't have estrogen or progesterone. It's just in different levels. But at ovulation, which is literally here on this graph at 14 days, you would have a surge of all of the hormones, well, apart from progesterone really. So you would have testosterone. That testosterone also increases at ovulation, hence why we have more confidence, we have more energy, we have more bit of a drive, because testosterone is increasing. We're like, we got to get things done, guys. We got to like go out after our dreams and do all of these beautiful, cool things, right? This is what ovulation is. I haven't understood it yet. I love ovulation. Cool. Now we go into luteal. So luteal phase is the yellow phase. Again, luteal, luteinizing, corpus luteum. Again, all of these things are named appropriately. Pero the luteal phase can kind of be separated into 2 weeks approximately. It lasts from day 14 to day 21, and then 21 to day 28 approximately. Luteal phase is our inner autumn. Things are slowing down, right? Things that were at the peak, the most sun, the longest days, things are slowing down. Days are becoming shorter. Leaves are falling on the floor. Like, things are just slowing down a little bit. Things are becoming a bit more cozy. This is what happens in luteal phase. So remember when I told you that in luteal phase, you have the corpus luteum, that in the corpus luteum is what secretes progesterone, right? What is actually happening with all the hormones within luteal phase? So actually during the first week, everything is dropping suddenly because the follicle that were growing stopped growing. So they now stop secreting estrogen, right? Because they're not growing anymore. And all the ones that have started growing but that did not erupt die off. So the estrogen is slightly, like immediately quick decrease. You can see it here, like it just shoots back down. Luteinizing hormone, FSH as well, go back down. And then they stay down for the whole thing because they don't need to be there. But as I told you, corpus luteum is what secretes progesterone. Progesterone is kind of like, we'll talk about the hormones a bit better in a bit, but like progesterone is the hormone that is like cozy. It makes the house, and it's the one that is responsible for the uterus lining growing. So what you can see here in the first week is that the corpus luteum is at an all-time high. And so it's secreting progesterone, right, for the first week up until here. Then it plateaus. And then what I didn't tell you, but I'm going to tell you now, is that corpus luteum also secretes a little bit of estrogen. So the estrogen that had completely decreased down after the ovulation, because all the follicles had died off or erupted and became the corpus luteum, is actually started to slightly increase again because the corpus luteum secretes a little bit of estrogen as well. So in the first week, what happens is that estrogen, LH, FSH all drop. So these hormones drop, but then the uterine lining will also start to grow, because I told you this is the role of progesterone. Progesterone allows the uterine lining to grow. And so you can see here that as progesterone is increasing, the level of the uterine lining is also increasing. It's becoming more vascular, it's increasing, it's becoming just like a nicer house. It's like, ooh, like we're renovating, right? We're increasing, we're making this house cool. And then I also told you that the corpus luteum secretes progesterone and also some estrogen. In the second week, as the corpus luteum starts to shrivel up, decrease in size, and slowly start to die off and become the corpus albicans, things are slowing down even more. So progesterone is slightly decreasing, just not slightly, it's decreasing. And then estrogen is also decreasing, right? And as I told you, luteinizing hormone, follicular stimulating hormone, all of this is low, because there's no need for something to be high right now. Because the reason why this is staying low, like I can add this sort of level of complexity, is that I told you that, that the ovaries communicate back to the brain, right? And so the brain is hearing, okay, progesterone and estrogen are high, and estrogen is not high to the level that it was before. So right now there's nothing there's nothing that we are supposed to do. We're hearing estrogen is at this level. It's a steady level. It's increasing, but it's really not that high right now. Progesterone is at this level. Cool. So we don't do anything right now, right? The only time that the brain will do something is if estrogen is too low. So the moment right now at the end of the cycle, when estrogen and progesterone go down, estrogen is too low and the brain is like, ooh, we're not getting a signal from estrogen. We're not getting letters. We're not getting a communication from estrogen. This is not good. So for us to get a communication from estrogen, we're going to have to start increasing FSH, so that the follicles start growing and then they create estrogen again. Okay, now that estrogen is secreted, we're okay. I like that. Cool. Oh my God, estrogen is too high, way too high. So now we're going to have to respond to the fact that it's super high by increasing LH and FSH, get the ovulation happening. And then once that the estrogen goes down, they're like, okay, cool. Estrogen is kind of increasing, but it's not near as high as the threshold. So there's nothing we should be doing. We're cool. We're not responding to anything really. We're just going to stay at a baseline, if that makes sense. So this is also the communication that's happening. This is why nothing is happening in the luteal phase here, why follicular stimulating hormone and LH are actually quite low. But if we go back to the end of the week 2 of the luteal phase, everything is decreasing. The uterine lining is increasing because of progesterone, but all the hormones are an all-time low. And it's when progesterone and estrogen go to an all-time low, all hormones are low, that the body now understands, okay, I'm getting no signal. No signal means period. No signal means let's bleed. And then the whole cycle starts again. And then you start bleeding, your menses happens, and then you start bleeding, and then the whole cycle starts all over again. So we've explained the whole shebang, the whole menstrual cycle right now. I hope it made sense. We still have quite a lot of things to talk about, but this is already a really, really good way, I think, that we've explained all of this. Let's just talk quickly about pregnancy. And because I told you that this is the house, right? What happens if you actually had the ovum that was secreted, and then there was a sperm cell there, they fertilized, and then they made an embryo, and then the embryo, let me go back here, the embryo will go from the ovary, fallopian tube, topple over into the uterus, and then into the housing, into the uterus lining. How is it that when you're pregnant, for people that didn't know, when you're pregnant, you don't have a period? You don't have a period because there's no uterus lining to shed. Why is there no uterus lining to shed? Because the baby is in the house that we created. That's why the uterus lining is not shedding. So what actually keeps the uterus from not shedding? Because we said progesterone and estrogen drop at the end of the menstrual cycle, and the drop is actually what causes the menstrual cycle to start, the menstruation to start. But what happens when you have a baby and you don't actually have a menstruation? Why does that happen? What happens is that actually we said progesterone, right, is what is secreted by the corpus luteum, right? That's what we said. And so this is why the housing, the uterus lining is increasing. It's becoming nice, cozy. It's a beautiful house. And then the corpus luteum is shriveling up, and it's like, oh, now I'm dying off, so that there's not as much progesterone there. But actually what's happening is that ovulation happens here. So if you had a sperm cell that was at day 14, and it kind of, I think the egg kind of survives for like 24 hours approximately. Within those next 24 hours, if there was a sperm cell there and it fertilized and became an embryo, the embryo will then, as I told you, topple over into the uterus and will then embed, choose a little cozy space within the uterus lining, and implantation happens. When implantation happens, the embryo divides, and actually within the embryo you have or like the kind of bag of cells, you have a part of the cells that will become you, the human, that will be created, but there's also a bag of cells that will become the placenta, which is a whole new organ that is created and developed during pregnancy, which is basically the organ that allows the mother and the baby to communicate, to share, they don't share blood, but to share nutrients. That's how the baby grows and is fed, kind of thing. If not, the baby would just die if you didn't have the placenta. And so actually what happens is that when the embryo is developing, And the embryo has like, let's say, sort of like implants around, let's say, day 17, day 18, something like that. I might be a bit wrong with that, but it implants sometime after ovulation, but definitely before menstruation happens. You then have the placental cells, the cells that will become the placenta, that actually take over. So they secrete progesterone as well. And so when the corpus luteum starts to shrivel up, it doesn't matter if that starts to shrivel up, because the cells that are already implanted within the uterus lining, they secrete progesterone as well, which keeps progesterone high and prevents the uterus lining from shedding. And so this is what happens. I tell you, this is a beautiful, beautiful process. And this is why when you fall pregnant, you don't have a menstruation. You don't bleed. And that's why you're like, oh, I guess I'm pregnant. That's the first sign, one of the biggest signs that you're pregnant. But we're not talking about pregnancy today, are we? We're talking about the menstrual cycle. Cool. Let's talk about cervical mucus, because I talked to you and I hinted at it a few times, but I didn't actually tell you what it was and why it's important. So actually, when you look at the overview here, you can see that all of these things, the hormones and everything, have an impact on the uterus lining, right? That's what I told you. But it also has an impact on the cervical mucus. So cervix, again, some basic anatomy: vagina, cervix, uterus, fallopian tube, and ovary here, that is within the fallopian tube, kind of. The cervix is actually the passage where the sperm cells, the sperm, will kind of go in, and then they'll just go both sides and hope that there's an ovum that is made to be fertilized. That's what happens when you're having intercourse and having sex. But the cervical mucus is actually kind of like mucus that, same that would happen in your nose. It's like mucus that is within the cervix, and different parts of your cycle. So depending on if you're in follicular stage, ovulation, or luteal phase, this mucus here will be more or less apt, more or less liquid, more or less concentrated to allow sperm cells to either pass through or not. So as you can think about the fact that ovulation is the moment where the egg comes out, right? The ovulation is the moment where the egg comes out and is waiting for sperm cells to be there to make a baby. So it makes sense that it's only during ovulation that the mucus that you see here is actually quite watery and allows the sperm cells to pass through. Those black things here are sperm cells. And then in menstruation and follicular phase and all of that, the mucus is actually a lot thicker, and it prevents the passage of sperm cells to actually go through. And it's the same thing in luteal phase. But let me explain this a little bit better. So let's look at this in different phases. So beginning, you have follicular phase. You can see here that the sperm cells, they can't really go through the cervical mucus, and it's actually called then a cervical plug. Almost like, like a cap, like you can't go through, it's closed. The mucus is dense. So this is kind of like if you looked at your own mucus, this is what like your mucus would look dense, and it forms a barrier to prevent this passage of spermatozoa, which is sperm cells. When it's ovulation, your mucus that you can see, because like you can see the mucus with it like on your underwear. Like I know we're gonna go into a little bit of like detail here, but like yeah, you can see it on your underwear. Don't lie to we all know. If you're a woman, we know. So the mucus is a lot more like stretchy, a little bit like egg whites, a lot more watery. And that's what happens during ovulation. And that's because the mucus here is actually so watery. It's not a plug anymore, and it allows the spermatozoa to actually go through and go to find the egg. I don't know if you can see here. This is the egg here, like the blue thing. The egg. And then when it's luteal phase, when the corpus luteum is happening, the progesterone is increasing, the lining of the uterus is growing and all of that, what actually happens there is that, again, you have the mucus is back to being dense. And again, if you looked at your underwear or whatever, you would see that it's a lot denser. It's not egg whites anymore. It's a lot more dense. And that forms, again, a barrier to prevent the passage of the sperm cells. So this is like the cervical mucus in the different phases. So that's also a way that you can start to see in what phase of your cycle you are at a little bit more. That's, again, a little bit of an overview if anybody needs to see that again. But I think I'm going to move on from that right now. And then let's go into the hormones, because obviously we've talked about them, but we haven't given them more attention than they needed to. But now it's time to talk about them a bit more. Entonces, vamos. So we have estrogen. As a reminder, estrogen is what increases in follicular phase. It's secreted by the follicles that are growing, right? So what is actually the role of estrogen? How can we describe her? How can we have an understanding of what estrogen does, the purpose of it? So estrogen, if you kind of did a character description, and that's how I got this information from Aggie Lal's new book called Biohack Like a Woman. It's described estrogen as like the go-getter. It's like super active, it's outgoing, it's adventurous. This is like the hormone that is like fun and exciting. And if you look more into the science of it, estrogen actually increases excitatory neurons. So neurons are the cells in your brains, neural pathways. I'm sure you've heard about things like that, but like estrogen increases excitation neurons. So neurons that like make things going, boosts things, increases the speed of things and all of that. That's very, very basic layman, gross science. And then you have estrogen also decreases inhibitory neurons. So it decreases the neurons that make things go slower. Hence why when you have estrogen, you like have more energy, you're super active, outgoing, adventurous. Also, estrogen has an effect on serotonin synthesis. I have papers that I put at the end of the description, and in the description and at the end of presentation if you want to look at it. I think it's Del Rio paper is the one that talks about this the most. So then it has an effect on both serotonin synthesis and dopamine synthesis. And this is just like the creation, the making of those hormones. And serotonin and dopamine are two very important hormones that allow us to feel happy, have energy, feel like, calm and happy and light and bright. So this estrogen has an effect on their synthesis as well. So you can imagine that if you have things going on within your cycle, you are also impacting those hormones that allow you to feel happy, light, and joyful and all that jazz. Then reminder, we're going to now progesterone. Reminder, progesterone is the hormone of the luteal phase. When you're creating the uterine lining, when things are slowing down. This is the hormone of luteal phase. So progesterone, the character description, again from the same book, from Aggie Lal's Biohack Like a Woman book, is more than nurturing. It's more of a homebody. It's more restful. It's more peaceful. It's kind of the calm and cozy hormone in comparison to the fun and exciting one of estrogen. And so when you actually look at the science and like what happens within the brain, actually see that progesterone decreases excitatory neurons. So it decreases the excitation of the neurons and it increases the inhibitory neurons. So it's kind of an opposite effect of what estrogen would do. It also has an effect on dopamine and serotonin, but the reason why I put this in italics is because this is very complex. As I told you, read the Del Rio book paper as well as another one. I don't remember which one it was, but I put all the papers at the end. But progesterone has an effect on dopamine and serotonin as well, but it has an effect that is dependent and modulated by the presence or not of estrogen before that. So depending on how much estrogen was present in the brain before progesterone arrived, so how much estrogen was present in the brain in follicular phase, it then impacts how progesterone affects those pathways, positively or negatively. But it also has an effect on the dopamine and serotonin synthesis. So yeah, it's quite complex and we don't really need to know that information right now. It's not that important right now, so we're just going to move on. But again, if you want to know more information about this, I told you they're on the papers. The other thing that progesterone does is that actually when you increase progesterone has an effect on your basal temperature. So when progesterone increases, your basal body temperature, so your temperature at rest, increases of about 0.3 to 0.4 degrees Celsius. When you go to bed, your nocturnal decline of temperature, so basically when you go fall asleep, your temperature decreases during the night, and then that's what allows you to be comfortable when you're asleep. That happens to everyone. Your temperature decreases when you're at night. Progesterone will also blunt that, so it will increase your temperature by 0.3 to 0.4 degrees, but it'll also decrease how low your temperature goes when you go to bed, and it also reduces your circadian amplitude, which just basically means how much your temperature varies throughout the day. This is decreased. Like the highest temperature and your lowest temperature is less when you have more progesterone than when you have less progesterone, if that makes sense. Cool. So now that we have kind of like a character description of the hormones involved, we can now understand this section of the graph. Remember when I told you, let's forget about the body temperature section? We're coming back to it. Do you see how your basal temperature here is quite low and then it increases and then it goes back down low? Can anybody know why? I told you that progesterone is the one that increases temperature, right? So, progesterone increases, basal body temperature increases. That's all. That's all there is to know. And that's literally it. But if I told you that half an hour ago, you'd be so confused. But actually, it's just so simple. Cool. Now that we've talked about all of this, we can talk about cycle tracking just before we move. I think the next section is literally cycle syncing. So to be able to sync your cycle, you need to be able to track your cycle. Why do you need to track your cycle? Because it's important to know what part of your cycle you're in. It's all good to know how the menstrual cycle works. Oh, it's menstruation, follicular, ovulation, luteal. But if you yourself, as a person that menstruates, if you're somebody that menstruates that's watching this video, it's no use to you to know this information if you, in your own body, you don't know at what point in time in your cycle you're in. So to be able to know that, you need to be able to track your cycle. Again, moving away from the period, no period. No. If you don't have your period, you could be in follicular phase, you could be in ovulation, or you can be in luteal. So it's important to know where you're at so you can be able to cycle sync. You can't sync anything. You can't change your behaviors depending on in which part of the cycle you're in if you don't know which part of the cycle you're in for yourself, if that makes sense. So how do you actually cycle track? The way to do this, I think that's quite good, is to observe your own body first. Observe how your mood changes, observe your mucus. We talked about the cervical mucus, so observing if it's more like sticky and thick or if it's more watery and egg whitey. That will give you a good indication as to where you are in your cycle. The moment your mucus is a lot more watery, much more stretchy and egg whitey, you know that you are closer to ovulation or ovulating. And when your mucus is a lot drier, a lot more dense and thick, you know that you're either in follicular phase or in luteal phase. That's a way to be able to track. Also, just your energy levels. When you're at the end of luteal, like the second week before the second week of luteal, just before your period, that's oftentimes when we have the PMS, so premenstrual symptoms, which are things that can happen when your hormones are just decreasing. You have less energy. You sometimes have mood swings. You're more emotional just because everything's crashing. And so again, when you're able to track these things and understand those things, you're like, okay, like I'm probably at the end of luteal right now, especially if just after you have your period, you can be like, I now know why I was so emotional, why I had such little energy, why I didn't do very well at the gym, all that jazz, why I had to have an extra nap that day. It all makes a lot more sense. So this is how you can kind of start tracking, is just observing your own body and observing how your body works, which can give you cues and clues. But it's not, I would say that that's not quote unquote good enough. It's really good to be able to properly track your cycle. So the best way to do this is with your basal temperature. So the ways you can do that, at least the ways that I do it, is with the Natural Cycles app. I think it costs about £60 a year to have that app. They send you a thermometer that basically you're supposed to because it's basal temperature. I told you this is basal temperature, right? Basal temperature is the temperature when you're at rest. So it would be the first thing you do in the morning. You have to take your temperature and then put it in the app, the Natural Cycles app, and then they have a whole algorithm. I can do a whole video about this at some point if you want to, but they have a whole algorithm that then tells you what phase of your cycle you would be in, kind of thing. And also you can track, because now that you know that when your temperature is low, you have to do this for a few cycles, but then if you know that your temperature is stable and low, that you're in follicular phase, the moment your temperature shoots up is like I've ovulated, and then when it stays high, you're in luteal, and then when it goes back down, you're menstruating, and then it stays low, it's follicular, then it goes up, you've just ovulated, then it stays up, it's luteal, then it goes down. So it's a very good way to understand and be able to track your cycle is with basal temperature. So what I would do is, that would be the best, I think, most efficient way to be able to track that is with your temperature. At least that's the simplest way that you can do it kind of like at home. Obviously, you can follow what this app tells you and use the temperature stick, but the thermometer. But I personally think that that's really, really difficult to do, because I don't wake up thinking, oh, I should take my temperature. Like, that's just not what I'll do. But what they've done is that they create an algorithm that works with the Oura Ring. I don't know if you see that. Like, I have the Oura Ring, and it's basically the Oura Ring already measures your basal temperature every single night. That's already something that it does. And then you can just sync your Oura Ring data with the Natural Cycles app, and then you can just sync those two together, and then you just basically have to do nothing. And at any single point, any single day, I know exactly what part of my cycle I'm in, what day of my cycle I'm in, and it's just really beautiful thing to do. But if you don't want to invest in that right now, that's completely fine. You can already start tracking your cycle just with a simple calendar so this is the Oura Ring app, but then you have like the Flow app, for example, or Clue app, or there's a lot of other apps that for tracking your period, your menstrual cycle. But basically what you do is you would put your period in when your period starts, how heavy your period is, kind of like how long your period lasts. Every day you would just put it in the app. And then you know that your first day of your period is your first day of your cycle. And then if you're regular, you can kind of know that, okay, if I had my period that day, I know for a fact that in 28 days I should be having my period again. And so because you can kind of do simple math, you can kind of know, okay, if my cycle is 28 days and my first day was this day, I can safely, quote unquote, say that my ovulation is happening on day 14, so in exactly 2 weeks. On top of that, if you put the fact that you can feel and you can see that your mucus is a lot more watery, much more egg white, all that jazz, you're like, okay, I'm probably ovulating. And then you can be like, okay, in 2 weeks I'll have my period again, so the next 2 weeks are my luteal phase. So you can kind of add observation techniques to just simple tracking your period with an app and be able to understand that. But again, like, just layer it, like, do it as whatever feels good to you. Some people just use a calendar, like, just a simple, you can put it within your calendar of your phone. Like, there was a time when these apps did not exist and you would just put it in a calendar. When I started tracking my cycle, which was like so many moons ago, basically I think my first cycle, I was already tracking it. My mom had like a little baby calendar, and you just had to write every time you had your period. It was cute. But now we have apps to do that, so that's even cooler. So that's how you would track your cycle. So now that we know how to track our cycle, it's only now, after an hour of talking, that we can talk about cycle syncing. So what is cycle syncing? Cycle syncing is the practice, and I think I got this definition from internet. The practice of adapting your health and lifestyle habits to fit the 4 phases of your menstrual cycle. So adapting the way you do life, adapting your lifestyle to the part of your cycle that you're in. Because as we said, our hormones go up and down, and so at different times, if your estrogen is really high, you're adventurous, you have your go-getter. But if your estrogen is low and your progesterone is high, you want to be more cozy, more nurturing, more at home. Like, you have different needs at different points of your cycle. And so it's kind of cycle syncing is honoring those fluctuations and working alongside of our biology rather than opposing it and fighting against it. So that's the definition of cycle syncing. And the other thing that there was on this slide is, why is it important? I think I kind of told you that already, so we'll move on. So what are we going to talk about in cycle syncing? So for cycle syncing, you can do a lot of different ways. You can cycle sync for a lot of different things. But what I'm going to talk to you guys about today is workouts, foods, productivity / energy levels, and then sex drive. We're going to do all 4 of these things. I think I might do more detailed videos about each and every one of those things at some point, but I'm going to give you like big general, already good places to start with this. So let's start with workouts. So I put here follicular, ovulation, luteal. Follicular is estrogen dominant, luteal is progesterone dominant, ovulation, all hormones are kind of high. I talked about this. So what sort of exercises are better? So because of in the menstrual cycle, menses specifically, so period, your hormones, all of your hormones are kind of like an all-time low. It's good to be doing some low intensity workouts, so more like yoga, Pilates, walking, just because your energy is probably a bit lower at that point in time. Then when you're in a proliferative phase, like your estrogen is increasing, as I said, it's the fun and exciting hormone, it's adventurous, the go-getter, you're you have more excitation neurons in your brain, dopamine is increasing, serotonin is increasing, all that jazz. Everything's quite fun. Everything's on the increase. So follicular, like the workouts, it makes sense that you have more energy. So your energy levels are increasing. So it's more like medium to high intensity exercises. So cardio, weight training, dance workouts, anything that is like medium to high intensity. The other thing that I want to say as well is with cycle syncing is don't just follow blindly anything that somebody tells you. It's really important that you also honor the whole thing about talking about women's superpowers is that we are really good with intuition. A lot of the times women are, I think, more naturally blessed with good intuition than men. That's just one of our differences that we have, as a general statement, and if you generalize it, obviously. And because of that, please just follow what feels good to you. Don't just blindly follow something. If you feel at some point, even though you're in ovulation, you're like, oh, my energy is really low, just listen to your body first. Don't just listen to people telling you should be doing this on this day of your cycle and this on this day. Like, no, listen to your body and know and appreciate that your body is smart, it's intuitive, and it already knows what it should be doing. But a lot of the times we dumb down what our body is telling us and we just assume that our body's wrong when it isn't. Vale? Cool, moving on to ovulation. Ovulation is like, again, everything's high. So you have a lot of energy. It's more high intensity workouts, HIIT training, really, really intense weight training, really intense cardio. Like everything is really high. So important to just do high intensity, like important. It's suggested to do high intensity workouts then. Luteal phase, week 1. Things are on slightly increasing still. Remember, like progesterone and estrogen are increasing. So again, back to medium to intensity workouts, kind of like follicular. Cardio, weight training, dance workouts, as I mentioned. And then week 2, things are really decreasing. So it's time to slow down. Our energy are decreasing. So slowing down as well, our workout practice is going to be good for us to like not stress ourselves out too much. Because if you think about a workout is actually a stressful thing. We're putting our body through stress, in a good type of stress, but we need to make sure that our body has the energy, the space, and the ability to hold that amount of stress. And sometimes we just don't. So in the end of luteal, our body is busy getting ready for a possible pregnancy, but also it's just everything slowing down, more of in nurture mode. So it's important as well to honor that. And if you put yourself through too much stress, your body's going to be like, oh, this is too much. Like I'm too stressed. I can't do this. So at the end of luteal, it's really important to slow things down, more lower intensity, like yoga, Pilates, walking, stuff like that. Now moving on to eating. I found actually making this slide was quite difficult because I'm not really someone that follows very strict diet plans at all. I don't even follow any diet, to be fair. I eat well, I eat healthily, but I think it's quite difficult I'm very much like somebody that just follows what my body needs, what my body wants. And so I find it a bit weird and difficult to be like, you should be eating this, you should be eating that. But I know that some people like that, and sometimes it's a good place to start to just follow a bit of a plan and then deviate that plan when you're like, okay, I understand what my body needs, I understand what my body wants. So what I've done is that I have the book from Elisa Vitti, which is the woman I think that created and pioneered the whole cycle syncing system. And so I just basically did a few screenshots of the foods that she recommends eating in each part of the cycle, and kind of like the bit of rationale behind it. So follicular, in your menstrual cycle, it's important to eat nutrient dense food like red meats, kidney beans, buckwheat. She also says that protein, fats, veggies, and fruits with a low glycemic index. Low glycemic index are like low sugar. Like think blueberries and blackberries are good because it will keep your blood sugar steady while adding fiber and antioxidants. Seafood, kelp, and nori can help remineralize your body with iron and zinc, because obviously you're losing those as you're bleeding, which you lose during menstruation. Then in proliferative phase, it's important to support the estrogen increase, especially at the beginning of it, with like food that mimics estrogen. It allows for your body to, just have a bit more estrogen going and increasing it in a bit more of a fluid way. So pressed salads like kimchi, sauerkraut, I don't know how you pronounce that, plenty of veggies, lean protein, sprouted beans, nutrient dense energy sustaining grains like oats. In ovulation, what she recommends is more of like, a lot of what she said is that in ovulation, it's the time of the month where our temperature is at the highest. As we said, like the basal body temperature is increasing. And so I think so she said that it's important to have foods that it's kind of the time of the month to eat foods that are cooler. Like it's better to eat like raw food because it allow you to cool down your body. And also have a lot of fiber. So filling up on veggies like red bell pepper, spinach, tomatoes, fruit for the cooling effects. And then luteal phase, that's kind of like the more difficult one that I couldn't really separate as easily. So I'll just read that quickly to you. So to curb the cravings that are happening, so proactively eat slow burning carbohydrates like brown rice, sweet potato throughout the day. Shift your diet to emphasize foods rich in B vitamins, calcium, magnesium, and fiber. Cooked leafy greens such as collards, mustard greens, and watercress, which are high in calcium and magnesium to reduce fluid retention, something that affects many women in luteal phase. And then consuming high fiber foods like chickpeas, pears, apples, and walnuts will help your liver and large intestines flush out estrogen more effectively, because we don't want to have too much of a high estrogen happening in luteal. We want it to be more progesterone based. So if you have a lot of estrogen, you want to have, you want to have foods that will allow you to flush out the estrogen better. And then in the second half of the luteal phase, so the second week, when estrogen levels dips, it's time to boost your healthy intakes of natural sugars, such as roasted and baked root veggies. Keep filling up on complex carbohydrates such as millets to stabilize serotonin and dopamine levels and help prevent mood swings. Cool. So again, for food, I think it's quite complex because this is like just really a very basic, simple guide. Even then, I don't really think that it can give you that much information, but I would say follow your intuition, follow what your body needs. And if this is something that you want a more detailed, in-depth video, I can do that later on. Or also just get her book, the Elisa VT book. I think that was from In the Flow book. So yeah, that's for the food. I think that's where I'm going to leave it at for the food. Next thing, my throat and my voice is like, oh. Next thing I want to talk to you guys about is productivity levels and like what, kind of like your energy and like what you're good. Women can do every single thing at every single part of our cycle. Do not get me wrong. But there are just certain parts of our cycle where we're better at doing certain things than other times. So follicular, during the menstruation, we're better at like evaluating things, intuition, going inwards, reflecting, preparing for a new month, journaling, all that stuff. Then in proliferative phase, we're more creative, where we get better ideas. It's the time to like brainstorm, create lists of what you want to do, create your new business plan, figure out a new creative way of responding to a problem that you've had at work, kind of thing. Ovulation is when we're better at communication, collaborating. It's the point of their cycle where we're the most attractive, not even like just like as in like we change when we're ovulating. Research has shown that like we are more attractive to people in ovulation. We're more likely to get a promotion when we're ovulating. They've done science and they've done a research thing with like strippers and clubs, and they had a group of strippers that was ovulating, a group of strippers I think that was on the pill, and maybe another group, I don't remember. But basically the group of strippers that were ovulating had twice as many tips than strippers that were not ovulating or were on the pill. So again, ovulation is our superpower, ladies. It really is. So in ovulation, we're better at communicating, collaborating, we're more confident, we have more energy, we flow better, we feel sexier, all that jazz. And then luteal phase is the more of like nurturing, as I said, cozy. It's like calm and cozy, the progesterone hormone. So at that point of time where it's more nurturing, it's more the moment in time where we can get our head down and get our projects done, put our projects to completion, actually work on the things that we started creating and in proliferative phase of follicular. It's kind of like doing the things, nurturing, tending to the things that we've maybe put on the back burner a little bit. So that's kind of like a rough idea. Again, follow this as you want to. There's a lot of in-between gray area, but this is, if you actually look at your own cycle and start tracking it, you're going to realize that at different phases of your cycle, you're better at doing different things. And it's kind of mind-blowing, to be honest. And then we're looking at sex drive. Sex drive is important, guys. It's important. So we're going to look at it and we're going to talk about it. And I'm hoping if there's still men around, still people, partners that are listening to this, open up your ears, guys. We do not have the same sex drive at every single part of our cycle, okay? When we're menstruating, as I said, we're like going inwards. It's the inner winter. The sex drive, it's not that it's non-existent at all. It's just that it's low. You're not necessarily wanting to have sex then and there. You're more like, I need like somebody to take care of me and hold me and hug me and all that jazz. So the sex drive is a lot lower then. Then proliferation. I think the sex drive would be rising. Estrogen is rising, right? You're rising. You're like, oh, okay, like cool, like I'm feeling a little bit like okay. So it's rising, and then ovulation. Obviously, ovulation is when you're meant to make babies. Ovulation is the point in time of the cycle where you are supposed to make a baby. So, ovulation. The sex drive is a different level of sex drive, people. For women that actually do ovulate and are not on the pill, I'm sure you know what I mean. And for men that are in relationships or whoever's in a relationship with a woman that ovulates and that doesn't have a pill or some sort of contraception in that way that stunts the hormones, I'm sure you know what I mean. I'm sure you know that sometimes you're like, what was that? What was that situation that happened last week? And then you actually look back on the calendar and you're like, I was ovulating. That's why. So I'll just leave it at that. Ovulation, different level of sex drive. Different level of sex drive. And then luteal, it's kind of still high at the beginning of the luteal phase. And then it slowly but surely starts to lower, dwindle down to the lowest phase when it's like, I just want to be held and hugged and cuddled and taken care of because I'm menstruating. That makes sense? So that's that, like, I think that's just the references of the video. And I think, guys, we made it. I think we made it to the end of this video. I hope this was useful. I know I didn't spend super long amounts of time on cycle syncing, but I will have videos that will be more in depth on that. But I wanted to give you guys a general overview of this and just showing you that we as women have different phases of our cycle, and it's important to use them appropriately, understand how they work appropriately so that we can then use them to our advantage and organize our life slightly differently, right? Just realize that we have those superpowers. We have moments in our life where we're better at being creative, moments in our life where we're better at nurturing and getting a project done and sitting down and getting the work done, and moments in our life where we're just good at like communicating and being outdoorsy and being confident and outwardly to the world and being like, look at me, I'm so cool, so sexy and all that jazz. We fluctuate, and this is the beauty that we have as women. We fluctuate, and it's so cool and it's so beautiful and it's so magical to be a woman, to get to be able to know your body in a deeper way, in a much more intimate understanding of what your body needs at different points in time. It's just such a beautiful process, and I just really, really love it. And I'm so glad that I'm finally able to get this video out so that you have a really in-depth, detailed video of how the menstrual cycle works, and then after that we can really dive deeper into cycle syncing a lot more with different videos on how to do specific things. But yeah, this video is long enough. I'm gonna go. I really, really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to my channel, like this video, share this video, leave a comment, subscribe to the podcast, leave a review. I would really, really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm gonna go edit this, and I love you guys so much, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. Bye guys.